On behalf of the Lawrence History Center Board of Directors, our staff and volunteers, we welcome you to our symposium, Reclaiming Urban Renewal, Community Efforts and Impacts in Lawrence, Massachusetts and Other Industrial Cities. We're delighted that you're all here today. We're delighted that it's raining, so none of you were tempted to mow your lawn today instead of coming here. This is the third symposium that the Lawrence History Center has done since 2012, when we commemorated the centennial anniversary of the great Lawrence textile strike of 1912, otherwise known as the Bread and Roses strike. In 2014, we conducted a symposium on new immigration, post-World War II immigration into Lawrence and other similar communities. And today, of course, our focus is urban renewal. I want to start by first thanking our sponsors who made this day possible for us to be here. UMass Lowell, Professor Bob Forant, who is one of our the Lawrence History Center Board of Directors members, has been key in realizing funding for all our projects and also committing a tremendous amount of time both to the History Center but also at the university, conducting a seminar on the subject of urban renewal, many of his students are also presenting later today. We want to thank Mass Humanities for supporting us with a project grant. I don't know if David Morgan is here in the room yet, but he's representing Mass Humanities today, so we want to thank them for their support. Northern Essex Community College also supported us. They have campuses in Haverhill and in Lawrence and are investing literally millions of dollars to the Lawrence campus here, and so we're grateful that this falls within their mission as well. The Lawrence Cultural Council, the Rosalind Wood 2011 Charitable Annuity Trust. Rosalind Wood is here in the room, and we thank her for her support of the Lawrence History Center, but also of Esperanza Academy. We have a table full of Esperanza girls here, and we're so delighted that they're with us today. The Catherine McCarthy Memorial Trust supports this. I also want to thank YDO. It's a youth development organization up on the 5th floor of this building. Mark Kempert is their director. He'll join us later, but they have all of the presentation rooms today are within their spaces, and so we thank them very much for that. And the Everett Mills, of course, our host. Marion Paley, their owner of the mill, will also be joining us later. But she is the most civic-minded, generous person, an urban planner by training, who takes on the heroic undertaking of maintaining this mill, which is 525,000 square feet of mill space. So we're in about 5,000 square feet, so if that gives you any perspective. And I also want to thank all of you. So those of you who are attending, we're grateful that you're here. The presenters who have really been working on this going back almost a year when we first released the call for participation. The fact that you've stuck with us and you're here presenting today means the world to us. And what also moves me deeply is to see so many of you who have conducted your research at the Lawrence History Center, who have supported us, who are here presenting today. It just, at all levels of scholarship, from middle school up to postdoctoral work, so many people doing their master's work and their PhD work and using the valuable archival resources over at the History Center, which, no small detail, is right behind me. Out the window. So if you care to look out the window, you'll see the Lawrence History Center is at 6 Essex Street. There's actually a panel in session 4 over at that location, and it's representatives from our staff and volunteers and special collections archivists from the Lawrence Public Library who are presenting about all of the wonderful resources on the topic in the city. So welcome, everyone. Quickly, the quick version of the history, and then we'll get down to our keynote speaker. Lawrence, as you know, is a planned industrial city. It was carved out of 2 rural towns, Andover and Methuen. In 1844, we all would have been sitting in Methuen. Some industrialists called the Boston Associates chartered the Essex Company in 1845 to come here and build the Great Stone Dam, carve the canals, and begin to plan out the city, where the streets would be, where the churches would be, the schools, common places, open spaces, 17 acres on the North Common for people to gather. They chartered the company to sell water power to the mills that they would envision lining the river to support the textile industry. So in 1845, waves of immigration began. Irish, French Canadian, Eastern European, Poles, Lithuanians, Germans, all began to come, about 15,000 people every decade. Fast forwarding to 1912, when we had 86,000 people living in the city, half of whom were foreign born. The city was producing 25% of all the worsted wool in the country on just this small city, 7.5 square miles. And 2 million yards of worsted wool were being produced every week. So as the 20th century progressed, after World War II, the textile industry began to go south, literally and figuratively. And that decline is what brings us here today, in part. Lawrence and cities like Lawrence handle that decline of their industrial centers, and how urban renewal affected communities, neighborhoods, and people in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s are what this whole day is about. So with that, I'm going to thank you again, turn the microphone over to Professor Bob Forant. He is the co-chair on this project, and he will say a few words. Thank you so much.
Good morning. That was weak. Good morning. Good morning. Thank you. I do that in class every morning, and I usually get the same weak response, and then I try again. I don't usually wear ties, but I cracked out my city tie today. This is a Jerry Garcia tie. So if later on you're curious, you can come up. Don't stare too, don't get right up on it. But it's very much what I would like to see a city be. And these banners, this beautiful artwork, we're going to talk more about at lunch. But this is a project that lots of Lawrence young people engaged in to envision, imagine what they would like the city of Lawrence to be. And it's just amazing work. And you should all take some time at lunch or at some point during the day to read their words and actually be inspired. This has been an interesting project. I think the Board of the Lawrence History Center decided doing one of these every 2 years wasn't going to work, so we decided not to do another one for 3 years because we've done 12, 14, and now 16. And so come back in 2019 and see what's in this building. We keep moving from floor to floor as it fills up, which is an exciting thing. So I have the pleasure of introducing our keynote speaker, Elizabeth Cohen, the Dean of the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study. And back in the winter, it was cold, I remember. I drove to the Alewife Tea Station, took the tea into Harvard Square, walked over to the Radcliffe Institute and asked her if she would be interested in coming, and she said yes immediately, which is amazing. Usually academics hedge their bets. They want to think about it. They want to debate hem and haw, but her dedication to the topic and I think was really important. And again, right away, she said yes, she'd be excited to come and keynote this morning's sessions. So Elizabeth Cohen is the Dean, as I said, of the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study. She's the Howard Mumford Jones Professor of American Studies in the Department of History at Harvard University. She's an expert on 20th century American social and political history, the author of Making a New Deal, Industrial Workers in Chicago, 1919 to 1939, a book I've used in my labor history classes many times. The book won the Bancroft Prize in American History and the Philip Taft Labor History Book Award, and was as well a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. Her next book, A Consumer's Republic, The Politics of Mass Consumption in Post-War America, explored how an economy of mass consumption shaped a social life, culture, and politics following World War II. She has published widely in top history and urban studies journals, winning numerous awards and distinctions. Her writings have also appeared in edited collections and popular venues, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, the American Prospect, and the Boston Herald. She's also the co-author with David Kennedy of a widely used U.S. History College and AP textbook, The American Pageant. Her latest book project, and what she'll probably be talking about this morning, I would imagine, is a book titled Saving America's Cities, Ed Logue and the Struggle to Renew Urban America in the Suburban Age. The book considers the benefits and costs of rebuilding American cities through the life and career of urban planner Ed Logue, who contributed to major development projects across the Northeast, including the quote-unquote New Boston that emerged in the 1960s. If you're familiar with the taking down of the west end of the city of Boston and the monstrosity that we call Boston City Hall, that was part of the vision for the new Boston that emerged in the 1960s. Cohen received her undergraduate degree from Princeton University, master's and doctorates in American history from the University of California, Berkeley. She's a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and currently, as I said before, the dean of the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study at Harvard University, a position she's held since 2011. Please help me in welcoming her to the stage.
Does that seem good? Well, good morning, everyone. Good, that's getting better. And thank you, Susan and Bob, and to all the other organizers. We organize a lot of events at the Radcliffe Institute, and I know how much work goes in to an event like this. It isn't always visible to the participants, but I thank you for that. And I'm excited to be here. It's a great pleasure to be here, and I didn't hesitate, as you said, because I welcome an opportunity to have a conversation with a broader public than I ordinarily do in my life as dean and a faculty member. I think we have an inspiring day ahead with contributions from an enormous number of individuals and communities. And I want to thank everyone for making that effort to share their own thinking and work with the rest of us. It's also wonderful to see so many young people here. That's not typical at a conference like this, and it's great to see. I think it's probably safe to say that all of us who are here today share a commitment to making and keeping cities viable. And if we look around the United States, I think we see some cities that are thriving. New York City, San Francisco, Boston, close to here, and many others struggling. Detroit, Cleveland, Milwaukee, Flint. We could go on, and after today, I hope to have a better grasp on what's actually happening in Lawrence and Lowell. But this was very much the same case in the 1940s, the 1950s, and the 1960s, but even more so. Today, we do have those cities that are thriving. That was not necessarily the case right after World War II. After the war ended, the U.S. had an enormous housing shortage. Think about it. There had been at least 10 years of Great Depression, followed by the war. So there had been very little new building. Here were families had been delayed, but now they were starting and proliferating, and there just wasn't housing. And the major solution that was promoted to this housing shortage, that was supported by a lot of federal government programs, was suburbanization. And that included cheap mortgage loans to veterans, FHA loans to suburban developers and homeowners, massive highway building to build up the hinterlands around cities for home construction, taking farmland and clearing forests and putting up suburban developments. And with the more wide-reaching federal income tax that was implemented during World War II, mortgage deductions became more attractive, another way of encouraging greater home ownership instead of renting, which had been before the war really the way many Americans lived in cities. And on top of all of those incentives to move out to suburbs, banks and other mortgage lenders were operating in the post-war period with the redlining practices that had emerged during the 1930s, which discriminated against many urban neighborhoods. So there were all these incentives for suburbanization, and there were many obstacles like redlining and others facing cities, and that all worked against urban investment. The U.S. seemed to be headed to a donut kind of metropolitan development with prosperous suburbs ringing declining cities, enticing all of those who could manage to do it, people seeking homes, jobs, because many factories also moved out, and retail, many stores moved out. I've written about this myself. There were lots of incentives to migrate out of cities. Now, I tell you this because I think it's this context, this crisis context that faced cities in the late 1940s and the 1950s is very important for us to remember as we go back and assess the urban renewal efforts of the 1940s through the 1960s, and to see what we can learn from them, positive and negative, as we tackle similar issues that face us in our cities today. And so it's also important, I think, that we examine this era of urban renewal as history and not just dismiss it out of hand as the bad old days. This is not easily, there is a tendency, just turning off the lights. It got dark all of a sudden. And this means not falling into what I think is a trap, an overly simplistic sort of contrast of extremes, often portrayed by the saintly Jane Jacobs versus the villainous Robert Moses. I would argue, and we won't really probably get into that today, but that they both had strengths and weaknesses in their approaches. In other words, what I'm asking is that we historicize and put these past actions in historical context, understanding as best we can how people at the time understood their problems, understood their choices, and understood their solutions, not impose what we may understand today from the perspective of 2016, but try to get back inside the heads of people who were coping with these problems that I've just laid out. Now, my discussion today of Boston and urban renewal is drawn from a book that I am near completing, I hope, and Bob mentioned it, Saving America's Cities, Ed Logue and the Struggle to Renew Urban America in the Suburban Age. And this is a book that looks at shifting strategies of urban redevelopment in post-war U.S. cities. And I build it around the career of Ed Logue, the man you see here. He may not be a household name today, but he was very well known in urban planning and redevelopment circles from the 1950s until he died in the year of 2000. He started off his urban redevelopment career working in New Haven in the 1950s, and New Haven was widely known as a model city of urban renewal, believe it or not, in the 1950s, and it really was a quintessential 1950s style urban renewal project with a lot of demolition, an effort to kind of redevelop downtown, put shopping malls, in a sense, downtown to fight what was happening in suburban New Haven. He then moved to Boston in 1960, and I need to clarify that he actually came to Boston after the West End disaster. This was not under Collins, who was the new mayor, and Logue. That had been a project of Mayor Hines, who preceded him, and Logue spent his career going around saying, I am not responsible for the West End. Someone I know who works in the history of housing said that he introduced him once at a planning conference in the 1990s, and he asked Ed Logue, well, what would you like me to tell people about you? He said, tell them I didn't tear down the West End. So he moved to Boston after that. And here in Boston, he learned some new lessons. He changed some of his strategies from New Haven, and he presided, as Bob said, over the birth of what we now call the New Boston. And that had a downtown component, government center in particular, and neighborhood dimensions. And the city did begin its road to revitalization. In 1968, he moved to New York State. He was brought there by Governor Nelson Rockefeller to head the first state-level urban renewal agency called the Urban Development Corporation, and that lasted until about 1975. And his last big job, sorry about that. That's for the UDC. And this is what I wanted you to see for the South Bronx. His last big job was heading a very small agency called the South Bronx Development Organization, which aimed to renew the devastated South Bronx. And he was there from 1978 to 1985. And here you see Jimmy Carter walking this area around Charlotte Street, which would be one of the projects that the SBDO took on. So using Logue as my narrative arc allows me to look at shifting strategies of urban redevelopment over half a century, and allows me to assess the lessons learned and not learned, strengths and weaknesses, benefits and costs of urban renewal. So I don't have a lot of time, so what I would like to do is leave you with some very key points that I hope will be useful as you go forward into today. I see that as part of my job as the keynote speaker. And then hopefully, not too long from now, you can read my book for more. The point number one that I'd like to make is that, and this you can probably guess from what I've been saying so far, urban renewal is not one consistent policy or approach over all time. From the Housing Act of 1949, which in many ways established it, until the mid-1970s, when President Richard Nixon basically unfunded many federal urban renewal and housing programs. So I'm saying this is actually varies. It isn't just one thing that never changed. Also, urban renewers did not operate in the same way at all times. As I've said, Boston's West End disaster was very much a part of that first phase in the 1950s of total demolition, and then there were many revisions to federal urban renewal over time, such as encouraging more rehabilitation of housing rather than demolishing, and we'll probably talk about some of that today. Point number two, urban renewal has left a very complex and mixed legacy, and understandably so. A recent Globe article, this was actually in October, for example, began with a first sentence that if the BRA and urban designers today, and the BRA is the Boston Redevelopment Administration, which Logue headed when he came, and I'm quoting from the Globe, if they were selling the same policy under any other name but urban renewal, they'd make more headway among Boston's wary grassroots activists who remember what that phrase used to mean, end quote. So in other words, I just use that to remind us that urban renewal does not have the best reputation, but I'm arguing that we need to really step back from some of those stereotypes, certainly condemn what should be condemned, but really try to understand it in greater complexity. Just to mention one aspect that might surprise you, I think it's important to recognize that urban renewal had a very progressive origin. It was created and implemented by New Deal liberals like Logue, who believed it was the responsibility of government, particularly the federal government, to revitalize cities and to provide affordable, adequate housing. President Franklin Roosevelt was their hero. They felt that the city was the new frontier for the New Deal, in a sense, that cities deserved a New Deal, needed a New Deal. And although there were many private real estate and corporate interests who, of course, saw opportunity in urban renewal, I think we distort the past to say that leaders like Logue were actually always promoting those interests. In fact, he was very opposed to letting private market forces drive urban redevelopment. He said things like, just a couple quotes, "I would never leave the development agenda to be set by the private development community." And then another quote, "Social needs have to be met through a public intervention." So he and others, I think, would be very appalled, were they alive today, to see the absence of a lot of federal funding for housing, for many urban projects, and the amazing power that many private developers have in setting the agenda for housing and urban redevelopment more broadly. Point number 3, Boston was in terrible shape in 1959. There's really no dispute over that. So when John Collins was elected mayor in an upset victory against the kind of political insider who everyone assumed would win, John Powers, this was after Mayor Hines of the West End situation had decided not to run again. So when Collins won, it was partly because people were in despair about the state of the city. And Collins determined that he was going to make turning around the city a top priority in his administration, and he brought Ed Logue from New Haven to Boston in 1960, and they together kind of empowered the BRA to help make renewal a possibility for the city. Boston was bleeding population, I mean, on a very obvious level. People were leaving the city, moving into the suburbs. There had been very little building in the city since the 1920s. There was little investment in downtown as well as in the neighborhoods. The city was almost bankrupt, and it had the highest property taxes of any city in the United States. And it was that bank that was getting very bad bond ratings, so it was very hard for the city to even borrow money. There was a deteriorated infrastructure, services, and housing throughout the city. At the root of the problem was a paralyzing stalemate between the old Yankees who developed cities like this back certainly their ancestors had, but the current sort of Yankee business interests were unwilling to invest in Boston. So they were on the one side, and on the other side was the Democratic machine. You've heard of Curley, probably. The machine ran the city and was rooted in the neighborhoods, and the strategy of the machine was basically to milk downtown through property taxes to feed the neighborhoods. But the machine also didn't do a lot to improve ordinary people's living conditions. The Yankees, the business world, responded to that situation by leapfrogging over the city and trying to control the city from the State House, which, as you know, was also in Boston. So that they were really putting a straitjacket on the city, giving it few powers beyond the property tax, because they just didn't want to support this machine that they felt wasn't supporting them. So it was a pretty big mess. And the city was really stuck. Collins and Logue, this is my point 4, focused on breaking that logjam. And they did so with a two-pronged approach, a downtown urban renewal and neighborhood urban renewal. Now, as they watched Route 128, I'm going to first talk about downtown. As they watched Route 128 be built and offices and retail follow, this is where the industrial park as a real estate entity really developed around our own 128. They watched residents leaving the city. They focused on developing Government Center as an anchor for the city. The plan had existed before Collins came in, but it really hadn't gotten anywhere, and there wasn't a commitment on from all levels of government. The idea was you'll have the city, you'll have the county, you'll have the state, you'll have the federal government all there. And the notion was, let's leverage that investment of government dollars, particularly federal dollars, and the presence of these government headquarters to revive downtown, bring more jobs downtown, and the number of jobs skyrocketed ultimately from 6,000 to 20,000 something, and push private business interests to break their logjam and invest in downtown Boston, seeing that there was really a new life down there, there'd be people down there, and so forth. Their goals were to expand the city's tax base, to create jobs, and to propel Boston to prominence as a regional center. We think of it today as a regional center. It wasn't necessarily at the time, of a new economy that they sort of recognized is pretty much what has happened, built around knowledge industries, technology, and service, including universities, hospitals, and so forth. To a large extent, they succeeded. Private and nonprofit investment did follow this government expenditure, and the city began to turn around. I just would say that not everybody would agree with you that the City Hall is a monstrosity. American architects have decided it's one of the most important buildings built in the 20th century. There's a lot of disagreement about that. The other part of the urban renewal were the neighborhoods, and there were major projects in Roxbury, both Washington Park and Madison Park neighborhoods within Roxbury, Charlestown, and the South End. The neighborhood urban renewal was more difficult to implement than downtown. Logue's slogan that he developed somewhat in New Haven, but really brought with him to Boston, was planning with people. This was a response to the West End disaster, but it wasn't always the case that that's what happened. So my point number 5 is the general argument that I make in the Boston chapters and in the book more generally is that it's important to recognize that there were strengths and weaknesses, achievements and failures in how urban renewal played out in Boston. And let me kind of give you a sense of a summary of what some of those are. So as I said, the city desperately needed resources. Public and private investment was needed to turn it around. And Logue did have a Midas touch. Boston went from the 17th to 4th in per capita dollars from Washington, D.C. And that was the largest investment made in a city of its size. So on that level, Boston did get government resources to jumpstart this stalemate. Some of Logue's strategies and his analyses were quite progressive and are still aspirations, I think, by many people today. And one of those that you kind of get a sense of here in this image, one of his major aspirations throughout his career was to have socially mixed neighborhoods, not to isolate low-income and minority residents in areas with poor services and inferior housing. He wanted to improve racial conditions in what was a very segregated and unequal Boston. And he felt it was crucial, and this was a crusade he was on his whole career, and it was one that he never succeeded really in achieving. He thought that cities' problems needed to be solved on a metropolitan level, that the cities were left with all the problems and they didn't have the tools they needed to solve them. And so he called for affordable housing in suburbs. That was not exactly a popular program, viewed from many suburbs. And when that wasn't possible, he advocated very actively the busing of minority students to wealthier white suburbs that had very good schools. That proposal ultimately did lead to the METCO program, a much smaller scale than he had in mind. But other actions of Logue and the BRA were less progressive and proved to be more problematic. Because he sought, this kind of ideologically was committed to these mixed neighborhoods socially, and the city's population was very much on falling, his BRA did not prioritize as much as it should have, providing sufficient replacement housing to keep those who were dislocated as urban renewal came to neighborhoods in their own neighborhoods. There was an assumption that there was housing elsewhere in the city. There were agencies, parts of the BRA, charged with finding people other housing, but they really didn't understand as well as they should have how important it was to people to stay in the neighborhoods where they were living. So often people were forced to leave neighborhoods even if replacement housing had been found for them. Second, as his slogan, planning with people, suggested, Logue did have a stated commitment to democratic engagement with communities, but he defined that democracy in a way that was very much expert-driven, top-down, more of a kind of social democratic, representative democratic model, what I call in the book pluralist democracy. In contrast to what developed in reaction to urban renewal, which was much more grassroots, community-based, what I call populist democracy. So there was really a tension. Both sides really saw themselves as operating in a democratic way, but they defined that democracy very differently. And a third point that I think it's important to see is that Logue never gave up on his belief that, and this is part of his metropolitan mindset, that a city's revival would benefit from highway construction. In New Haven in the 1950s, he had fought to keep the middle class living in the city as the only way as a way he felt to protect jobs down there, to keep them from moving out, to keep the tax base intact. By the 1960s, when he got to Boston, he accepted the inevitability of suburbanization. I mean, it was becoming such a huge national trend. But he sought strategies to keep suburbanites closely tied to downtown, and that involved the government center, as I said, was aimed towards creating jobs downtown. He rather wrong-headedly, I think, thought that highways would also be a way to do that, make it easy for people to come from their suburban residences to work downtown. And so he supported the Inner Belt and the Southwest Expressway in the very early years. He was long gone by the time the big fights took place and ultimately these roads didn't get built. The major argument I make about the impact of urban renewal in Boston, and this is very much an argument inspired by a PhD dissertation that was written in the 1960s by a man named Langley Keyes, who then went on to become a professor of planning at MIT, and it was published as a book in 1969 called The Rehabilitation Planning Game. And I learned a lot from his very much on-the-ground observations. And so what I really argue is that we need to look at urban renewal really as a negotiation between agencies like the BRA, leaders like Logue, and community residents and neighborhoods. So, for example, in the Downtown Urban Renewal Project, when Logue came to Boston, he pledged that there would be no more large-scale demolition like the West End. But he made one exception, which was to implement this plan that had been on the shelf for Government Center. And that entailed clearing an awful lot of Scully Square, which was the red light district in Boston. And the very widespread feeling was that there weren't a lot of people living there, they could get away with that, and that the benefit would be worth it. The original plan, you see below there, the Government Center, the original plan had actually called for more demolition than actually happened. And as a result of some historic preservationists like Walter Muir Whitehill and others, Logue became convinced that it was important to save historic structures like the Sears Crescent, which you can see there in the bottom picture, and the Quincy Market Faneuil Hall complex. And this plan to save Faneuil Hall and Quincy Market, which you can see was in pretty disastrous shape in the early 1960s, that really began under Logue and Collins and was completed under the next Mayor White. So there really was part of that negotiation downtown was to recognize that they shouldn't clean the slate so thoroughly, that there really was a place for historic Boston. In the neighborhoods, the outcomes varied greatly across neighborhoods, and they ranged from an embrace of urban renewal plans of the BRA, interestingly, in Roxbury, in the Washington Park neighborhood of Roxbury, led by Muriel and Otto Snowden, who ran Freedom House, which was a kind of community center, and others in that world of Freedom House and the Washington Park. And this is, again, why I say it's important to go back and understand these things from the point of view of people who lived at the time. For the Snowdens and for many other people in middle-class blacks who lived in the Washington Park neighborhood, who were homeowners, they very much saw urban renewal as a way of preserving their property values and the middle-class character of this neighborhood, which was one of the only neighborhoods in Boston where they could buy a house. And they saw that they worried terribly that it was going to become, much more of a poor neighborhood, that everybody would be sort of pushed into their neighborhood, and that they would then ultimately lose out. So, we need to understand that from their perspective. And then there were parts of Roxbury, like the Madison Park neighborhood, which did push back against a plan that the BRA had to put in a new high school, campus high school, Madison Park High School, which the original plan called for tearing down a fair amount of housing. That community organized and fought back and ultimately got a plan. Here's where the negotiation takes place, that included the high school, which the community wanted, as well as more housing. And there were other substantial community activisms that took place in Charlestown and the South End, which ultimately led to neighborhoods getting more concessions from the BRA than had been originally planned. So it turned out, I learned as I looked at all these neighborhoods in Boston, that the more that a community engaged with the BRA in public meetings, in organizing, in demonstrations, the more the community got back, and the better the neighborhood fared in the years to come. And I want to note here that my thinking was all, in addition to being influenced by the professor that I mentioned before, Langley Keyes, I was also very influenced by a conversation I had a number of years ago with Mel King. I think many of you must know him. He was know of him. He was a longstanding community activist in the South End of Boston. Eventually became a state representative. He ran as a progressive candidate for the mayor of Boston and so forth. And when I went to interview Mel King, and I've interviewed a lot of people for this book, I expected him to say what a total disaster urban renewal was for the South End. Instead, he actually surprised me, and he presented a much more nuanced analysis of how the existence of a government program called urban renewal and a public process for its approval, however flawed some of the planning may have been along the way, kept open the possibility for community mobilization that is not possible today with private redevelopment schemes that are worked out in back rooms. And in fact, as he told me and as I've learned, that community pressure led to winning an elected South End Urban Renewal Committee. Originally it was supposed to be appointed. It was elected. And the mobilization for affordable housing, why is this not, there it is, for affordable housing like Tent City and Villa Victoria. This was ultimately constructed after Logue left, but the point is that much more subsidized affordable housing has survived in the South End than one would have expected in a neighborhood so close to downtown that gentrified as the South End did. So let me conclude with just leaving you with 3 big points that I hope you will carry into the day today. The first is that I think we would benefit from thinking of urban renewal, at least in some places, as I said, as more of an interaction, of a negotiation between agencies like the BRA and people like Logue who led them on the one hand and communities on the other. Outcomes surely varied, but I think we do a disservice to both sides to just have a simplistic black versus white story of redeveloper exploitation and neighborhood victimization. That's one point. The second point I want to make is that this community pushback that began in the mid-1960s to some of the original urban renewal plans and continued into the 1970s, in fact, led the way to the next stage of urban redevelopment through community-based CDCs, community development corporations, and other community-based organizations that would take this lead in the next phase. And here I just want to give you an example. I mentioned to you that Madison Park struggle. It was a grassroots Lower Roxbury community corporation that created itself and negotiated with the BRA for a plan that allowed the high school and housing. They soon renamed themselves the Madison Park Development Corporation, And they claimed when they founded it themselves officially as that in 1966 that they were one of the nation's first CDCs. So in an ironic way, community mobilization in response to urban renewal and to a very public process of needing to get public engagement with it, not only made those plans better for many communities, but also launched this next phase of a more community-based urban redevelopment. And finally, one of the dilemmas that we face today, I think, is that we have CDCs and other community-oriented efforts building affordable housing, but it is very hard to scale that up to meet the huge, huge need that we face for affordable housing in particular. Many CDCs are piecing together grants, loans, operating on a very small scale. The need is much larger than that. We need to figure out how to do that better. And meanwhile, other strategies that really have more bucks behind them to build affordable housing are very dependent on private developers and corporate investors. And here I would just mention set-asides and inclusionary housing in otherwise upscale or even luxury projects. Low income, that depends on the developer in a lot of ways. Low-income tax credits and Section 8 vouchers that give the potential renter a voucher to take, but many landlords we know won't accept in the neighborhoods that many of these people would like to live. These approaches are all very dependent on the whims of the private market. And the result is, I think, that too many urban residents today are in need of decent housing, or they pay enormous proportion of their income for housing, or they are transient, and in some cases they are even homeless. And I also want to remind us that I think the aspiration that many of these urban renewers had to mix races and social classes in neighborhoods and community institutions like schools, that Logue, as I said, deeply believed in that, has very much declined, and in many cases is sort of off the radar screens today. So despite the many flaws in urban renewal, let's be careful to remember that that this was an era when many people who had power felt it was the job of government to ensure that all Americans had a decent home, as had been promised in the aspirational language of the 1949 Housing Act. And that had been preceded, just as a reminder, in the 1930s by a commitment to put up public housing. That has in many ways been abandoned, and in some cases for good reason. We know that a lot of public housing just ghettoized poor people and create environments that were not properly maintained, but it should tell us something. It should wake us up to know that despite the flaws in a lot of public housing, there are long, long, long waiting lists that existing today in most cities to get into that housing. Oh, okay. And also key, I think, if and when that access to decent homes failed, when people couldn't get the kind of the housing that they felt they had a right to in their own communities, given the sort of public nature of the urban renewal process, citizens had a democratic right and an ability to hold public officials responsible and accountable, which is not always possible when you're dependent on the deals worked out with private developers. And here, this is from the Tent City protests in Boston in 1968. So to really conclude, let me just say that it's my hope as we engage in this very important topic today that has huge implications, I think, for our cities in 2016, that we be willing to leave some of our conventional wisdoms and our stereotypes at the door and be open to thinking in fresh ways about the complicated and subtle lessons we might learn from the urban renewers of the 1940s through the 1970s. Thank you. Yeah. Glad to take any questions or observations from your own experiences, or one of these waters. Yes? Do you want to introduce yourselves when you speak so I know?
Sure. My name is Dan Cahill, and I want to thank you very much for framing the discussion today. Very interesting insights into urban renewal, especially some of the historic polarization that's occurred. But as a footnote to your review of Ed Loeb's career, Ed spent time here in Lawrence.
Yes.
And I think it was probably after his South Bronx experience. But
He came back from the South Bronx, right? He came back, moved back to Boston, and he was a consultant, and this was one of his projects.
Ed was here virtually full-time. It was kind of the twilight of his career. He was beset with some health problems at the time. But I think Ed was an attorney.
He was. He went to Yale Law School. He never really practiced law.
One thing he focused on in Lawrence, interestingly enough, was the condemnation and acquisition of property. We had a number of very interesting discussions about the future of the city, but he was here virtually full-time for about 2 years.
He was. I think the idea was to bring, was it Emerson College to Lawrence. It was a kind of a pipe dream, an effort to think about. I mean, in some ways, it's interesting to be reminded of that now, because in some ways he was operating with some of those same premises of if we bring the knowledge economy here, that could be a strategy for renewing the city, and it didn't ultimately work out. Anybody else have thank you for reminding me. I'd love to talk to you a little more later, if we could, about your experience. Yes?
Steve Beecham. I'm wondering if you could comment on two things. One is the degree to which a conscious desire to enhance downtown land value kind of ran through all of this stuff, whether it's urban renewal or the critics of urban renewal or even like modern day gentrification, that focus that the government's job is to build up land value at the expense of everything else, that thing. And in response to that, the fact that the battle over housing regulation goes back to much of this. The fight to get rent control in Boston, the fight now for just cause. So what's the relationship between all of them?
Well, let's take your first issue about land values, which, again, I think it's very complicated. Yes, we can condemn that as putting sort of downtown interests first, government supporting, that this is the growth, the growth machine in a sense. One could argue the alliance between business and politicians, but the reality is, I think, in a political economy and a political system where a lot of revenues to cities depended on property taxes, cities needed revenue to do anything. And so, you really have to, they're not there, when they thought of these service and knowledge, the universities, the hospitals, they weren't just thinking of banks. They were really trying to figure out how to make downtown viable to be competitive with suburban investment and development. And they didn't have a lot of tools. And they felt if we could increase property values, will bring in more revenues that we can use to improve infrastructure. We will also create more jobs, and jobs were always there in their discussions, is how to keep people in the city with jobs when you had so many employers moving out. And another thing that I found to be very interesting throughout Ed Loeb's career, and this isn't necessarily true for all people in this position, I suspect that there's lots of variation, he put a huge emphasis on improving schools. He felt that one of the major reasons why lower middle class people, when they could, moved out of cities is because the schools were failing them. They were attracted to suburban schools. And so he put, just everywhere he went, he put a lot of emphasis on that, and felt that was sort of a key way to keep this sort of mixed social world that he hoped to preserve and to create and preserve. The other question I don't really have a lot to say on your question about the rent regulations. There were, great concerns about how much development in neighborhoods would lead to rent increases. I mean, that was a huge concern. there, were efforts to, part of the problem that, I may not have conveyed was that they only had the tools that they could get from the federal urban renewal legislation. And there were very few programs to support the construction of subsidized housing. They mostly used a program called 221 DC, which was that basically got nonprofits like churches and unions to support the building of housing that could then get this subsidy. But they had to then partner with these local organizations, which was good in a sense because it rooted it in the communities. And in Roxbury, for example, there were a lot of unions and churches that went in on a lot of these projects. But there were not a lot, the federal legislation was very fraught with tension and conflict. The real estate industry wanted things that were going to help the private sector. There were sort of more liberal types who wanted this to be much more of a social program, an extension of kind of New Deal kinds of interventions. So there were a lot of fights in Washington, and the tools that were given to people on the ground were not great. And so they had to be very sort of imaginative in how they could do that. But it was a great concern, and it's one of the, probably more than, rents did go up, and there was a lot of worry and concern and community protest about that. The other problem was just the disappearance of housing, because there was a lot of very inferior housing that landlords had not kept up. In an era of, where most people were renting, and in a lot of these neighborhoods, the housing was very inferior. Not even with good electricity, plumbing, people still using outhouses. It was very hard. They tried to enforce, inspections to try to push code, make sure that codes were implemented. In some cases, the decision was just to basically tear things down, and here's where the problem came in terms of the replacement housing. Anything? Oh, we're at the end of our time. Well, thank you all very much. I hope you have a great day and that you learn a lot.